Hey guys, today we are learning all about how to make GIFs in Procreate, and specifically how you can make them and use them in your Instagram stories. So let's get started. Just a little disclaimer, I do say GIF, which, I know, very controversial, but if that drives you crazy, I'm sorry, you'll be hearing it a lot in this video. But yeah, just want to throw that out there. Alright, so before we get started, I'm going to sketch out a list of ideas for GIFs that I'd like to make today. This is just a good opportunity to practice shapes and themes, and if you're planning on submitting your GIFs to Jiffy, you might want to think about what kind of stickers people might want to use in their stories. Today I'm focusing on a new post GIF, a thank you one, and a little pennant that says, "You're the best." One thing to consider when you're making GIFs is what kind of shapes and icons do you find popping up in your doodles and your work often. So for me, it's flag or pennant shapes, stars, dots, sparkles, hearts. So think about what you find yourself drawing the most. That's just a really simple way to bring your personality and your style to the designs, and hopefully people will think of you when they're using them. Alright, so now that we have all those ideas sketched out, I'm going to start off with the new post idea. So I don't follow all my sketches religiously, I just like to get my ideas down and go from there to see what works, what doesn't. So for this one, I wanted to create kind of a banner style illustration that just says new post, so very simple. To add some character to it, I'm using the shade of yellow that I used for my shop logo. I'm keeping the shapes pretty blocky and simple, and I'm filling it in with this kind of textury pencil fill.
Even if you're crying, you know how to make me worry. I can tell you're lying.
So after I finished the main banner, I decided to go in and add some little stars and sparkles around the sides. I end up moving them later using the group tool, but to start off, I'll just show you how to get that flashing, sparkling effect. Basically, you draw out your first layer of sparkles and stars and dots, then you create a new layer, turn down the opacity of that first layer, and then draw over the stars with slightly different shapes. You can do a kind of flare shape where there was a cross shape. You can move the dots around in this layer, but turning down the opacity will show you where the first layer is, but you won't get confused with where you're drawing the new designs. So I usually create at least 3 layers of different sparkles and dots and stars to give it a little more of a natural movement. So when you make GIFs in Procreate, essentially each layer is like a slide of the GIF. And to keep all the moving parts on the correct layers, I duplicate the base design, which is on its own layer, and then merge it with each star layer. Also, just a side note, I like to keep one base layer duplicated but unchecked so it's not visible and it won't show up in the GIF, just as a backup in case something goes wrong. So I'll slow that section down so it's a little easier to see. Essentially, I start with that base layer, that new post layer, and then create a new layer for that first round of stars, another new layer for each round of stars, and then I duplicate that base layer and move it underneath each layer of stars and merge down so it's going to stay in the same place the whole time and that base part won't move. And then now, like I said, I'm moving things around with the group tool. This lets me move all of the base elements at once, so I know that none of them are going to be out of place in the middle of the GIF. So I'm just using the select tool to get them all together and then resizing them all at once. Been Another thing to keep in mind is that any layer that you don't want showing up in the GIF when it cycles through all those layers needs to be unchecked, so it's not visible on the canvas. That also goes for any blank layers where you don't have anything drawn. It'll just show up as blank space. So make sure to turn those off, uncheck them before you export your GIF, and you'll be able to see that in the little preview. So if anything looks weird or you're not sure why there's like a little pause or break or a weird movement in your GIF, go back and check which layers are visible and uncheck any that you don't want showing up in the GIF. For the next one, I'm creating my signature little stars and dots that I always do on my Instagram stories. This one is super similar to the last one. Basically, we're just creating that first layer, turning down the opacity, making a new layer, and then make sure before you check your preview that you're turning all the layers up to their full opacity. Otherwise, one is going to show up lighter than the others. So we want to have them all on full opacity. It'll look weird, but when you check it in the GIF preview, it'll look perfect. Next up, we're making a little thank you GIF. So I started out by hand lettering just the words thank you, and I put that layer on alpha lock. I picked my colors and I went over each of the letters with a different color. That way it's easier to keep everything connected and smooth. Next, I experimented with, I took out the color palette. Then next, I experimented with some different movements that I could do. Initially, I tried out a different kind of movement. I think I did some lines on the side. Oh, I did this tilting effect, which ended up looking super weird. Not a fan. So I switched it up, and instead I went with this little squiggly line under each of the words. And I wanted to create an effect that looked like I was drawing that line under the words manually. So to do that, you will duplicate that first squiggly layer that you made and continue to shave off a little part of it each time and keep duplicating. In this case, I created a group with the base layer and the squiggly line layer, so it was easier to merge down each time. You always want to double check in the GIF preview that the line is coming in the right way. The first time I did it, it looked like it was being erased. So I had to switch around all the layers, basically switch the order of all the layers to get the line being drawn in effect. Next up, we're making a You're the Best pendant. This time I'm creating a kind of flashing effect. So I started off with my base layer, the pendant. Next I created a new layer where I drew in those flashing lines, leaving some space in between. Then I turned down the opacity of the line layer, created a new layer, and drew identical lines in between each of those other ones. And in this case, I only created 2 different layers, so it looks like it's flashing back and forth, and that's really all you need to get that kind of effect. So for this one, I wanted to see how it looked with the white background, but then I turned it to a transparent background. That's what you'll need to do if you want to upload your GIFs to Jiffy. This is pretty much the same deal. For this one, I am doing kind of a rocking back and forth motion. And for this one, it's pretty simple. You just duplicate the layer, rotate it just slightly. If you do too much, it'll look kind of weird and jumpy. So you just want a very slight rotation. And you can do as many layers and as many tiny little rotations as you want, whatever looks natural. then here's how you can use GIFs, your own GIFs, if you haven't uploaded them to Jiffy, or if your account didn't get approved for some reason. You can always just use them as your personal GIFs, and they'll actually have better quality if you do them this way. So what you're gonna do is you save your GIFs as an animated GIF file in Procreate. You'll need to have an Instagram story already open and kind of in the works. Then you go to your Photos app, hit the share button, hit copy, and then go over to your Instagram stories, and a little button saying add sticker will pop up, and you can press that and it will add your GIF just as it would add a GIF from Jiffy. And then you can adjust it just like you would with any sticker, so you can move it around, you can tap it to flip it horizontally.
We found the perfect storm.
And that is it. So if you want to learn now how to apply to Jiffy to make your GIFs public and searchable on Instagram, I made a separate video about how I did that. So if you want to watch that, I will link it down below. Thank you so much for watching this. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it inspired you to make some GIFs of your own. If you're curious about the basics of Procreate or the more technical side of making GIFs, I linked some really helpful videos below, so make sure to check those out. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I will do my very best to help you out. Hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time.